Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, if we've learned anything over the past year, it's that the only thing certain is uncertainty. And given a lot of volatility and uncertainty, there's a huge chance for geopolitical tension and that things can escalate. Case in point, what we've seen in the Russia-Ukraine war and how a lot of this has become a standstill over the past 3 years. Case in point, what we saw in Iran and Israel and huge tensions over the 12-day war. And we think a matter of fact in terms of the geopolitical landscape is that we are shifting to a multipolar world, and to a large extent, countries need to start being to some degree more independent in terms of their foreign policy and their ability to be able to defend themselves. That is to say, we've seen the rise of other competing nations to challenge the US hegemony, just like India, just like China, and the only thing certain is that when countries get pissed off, there's a certain chance for them to be able to do things. That is to say, in order for North Korea, who we're going to talk about, enter stage right, to be able to come into this debate, we need to characterize and understand how exactly they are. Ladies and gentlemen, they've been a hermit hiding behind the bamboo curtain for far too long and are not necessarily clear or explicit in terms of their intention. But what we do know, coming from spies and research, is this idea of a continued and escalating nuclear program, ladies and gentlemen, given cultural, religious, and historical reasons that actually cause a divide between South Korea and North Korea. We need to understand that South Korea theoretically may be open to cross-border projects and discourse, but North Korea isn't. Case in point, the intuition pump and matter of fact here is the demilitarized zone. We've literally had that particular border between them creating some sort of tension, and it's something that puts these countries to a standstill. That is to say, if side opposition is going to posit that, it's our interest to be able to tear it down, hold hands, eat samgyeopsal and kimchi while watching Squid Game Season 3, guys, let's wake up. This isn't Crash Landing on You. This isn't a K-drama wherein everything is going to be fine, primarily because these particular individuals have those incentives. Meaning, North Korea has a diametrically opposed incentive as opposed to South Korea. Let's explain that. First point of framing, what exactly is the interest of South Korea? It's four-tiered, right? A is economic stability, which we think is a function of national security, wherein the businesses and people need to be able to feel safe and understand that you are not a force to be reckoned with. Sure, people might be spooked in the short term over security, but we think that for industries like the K-pop industry and other really important industries like automobiles, with that of Huawei, with that of Samsung and all of these other huge Korean companies, they need to be able to understand that if bombs come hitting, our government has a plan to be able to protect us and we won't necessarily just get invaded. B, the idea of security to be able to protect the border in terms of showing soft and hard power against a potential force who we don't know might choose to be able to pull off a particular Russia and potentially invade us at some point in the future. Meaning, a lot of this is uncertain. We need to be able to err on the side of caution and be able to be motivated by mutually assured destruction. That is to say, when we are able to show strength that we have other actors like the US and Japan who are there to be able to help us, and we're also there to be able to fortify ourselves, we are a force to be reckoned with. Lastly is in terms of being able to grow their ally base with Japan, the US, and other nations. I understand Korea and Japan in the war don't necessarily have the best kind of intention, but we think that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and there are mutual interests to be able to keep Korea in check, particularly North Korea. Before that, POI, whoever was raising it, go for it. 3, 2,
This is another debate, but we don't assume that on our end it cannot be possible to pursue these particular ties. You engage on a comparative level, why you as an actor ought to actively prioritize that. You cannot shit your wall by saying it can't happen. Engage.
Yeah, that's the debate. Maybe you guys can say it in your speech. We're saying it's not in their interest to be able to have this form of diplomacy, because we need to understand why we shift to Yoon away from Moon in the first place. They didn't do it willy-nilly, right? The reason why they did that shift in the first place was because of escalating tension within the border, and the way North Korea, especially with what we saw during and post-COVID, just hasn't necessarily been responsive. Meaning, theoretically, yes, this diplomacy can happen, but this debate is a value judgment debate, particularly through the lens of South Korea, and we're saying it's not in their strategic interest to do so. For structural reason, let's take a look at why Yoon was impeached and suck the oxygen out of their case, because they might say, oh, it's going to be bad. We need to understand that Yoon was particularly impeached because of certain problems and issues with the legislative branch. This wasn't necessarily related to their particular shift in stance towards North Korea. What we've seen through polls and how people have been reacting in interview and media is that for once in a long time, we have a bipartisan consensus, whether you're on the conservative right or the democratic left. People are agreeing that they're worried about this particular threat and want some degree of security in order to be able to make sure we get protected. That is to say, the particular interest of South Korea to its constituents and the people who are living there is to be able to show that they actually have the capacity to be able to protect them, and they're not at the mercy of a madman or someone who can be volatile in instances where anything can happen. I'm not saying something will happen. I'm saying that we need to be able to be ready in the worst case that it does, in order to even show that we are a force to be reckoned with. Because on their side, absent that, they have a burden to be able to prove that they even have the motivation to get into diplomacy in the first place and be able to have these particular cross-border projects. Even if that were the case and they were open to it, we think that the upside in terms of GDP, in terms of security, in terms of perception for South Korea is to really be able to bolster its own interest and be able to not necessarily be outcome dependent on what North Korea might want, because unfortunately, that ship has sailed a long time ago and people have a different perspective in terms of what they want. And in order to be able to protect things like the economy and to protect particular people, we need to be able to rise up and protect it. For all these reasons, we are very proud to open this debate and stand on side proposition.